Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Fahrenheit 2024 artist panel with Susannah Israel and Luke Huling. I'm Pam Aliaga, the exhibition manager here at the American Museum of Ceramic Art in Southern California. AMOCA champions the art, history, creation, and technology of ceramics through exhibitions, collections, outreach, and studio programming. This event will be recorded, so if you're a bit camera shy, feel free to turn off your video and politely stay muted until the end of the talk. We will have a brief Q&A with our artists at the very end of the talk, so you guys can ask those questions that you're dying to ask. Before I introduce these wonderful artists, let me tell you a little bit more about the exhibition they're in, Fahrenheit 2024. This exhibition presents 100 pieces, all selected by juror Kathy King. We received about 500 submissions from contemporary artists all over the United States in response to our open call. The selected pieces range from traditional vessel forms to experimental creations to larger scale installation. We're excited to share the diversity of ideas, influences, and craft presented in this exhibition. Now, I'm happy to introduce our first presenting artist for today, Luke Huling. Luke is a ceramic figure sculptor from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He currently resides in North Carolina and is an associate professor of Sandhills Community College. He received his BFA at Edinboro University and his MFA from Indiana University. He's a past resident at the LUX Center for the Arts and Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts. He is a scholarship recipient of the National Society of Arts and Letters and the inaugural recipient of the Chris Boger Memorial Award. Amazing. So I'll pass it off now to Luke for him to present his.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Again, my name is Luke Huling. I'm a ceramic and metal sculptor, and in order to tell you a little bit more about the piece that I have in the show, I figured I would kind of start at the beginning of my career and talk a little bit of how I got to the work that I'm dealing with right now. So, as Pam mentioned, I'm originally from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the outskirts of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in a town called Enola, Pennsylvania. And when I was young, I started my academic career actually as a dental hygienist. And it wasn't necessarily because I had a passion for teeth by any means, but I really let the opinions of others really influence me at a young age. And I knew that I liked to work with my hands, so that was the next best logical thing in my mind at the time. I remember sitting in the back of my anatomy class in dental hygiene school, and I realized if I never went to art school, I was going to regret it my entire life. So that's what I did. I actually decided to transfer to Edinboro University and study ceramics. And in that early work, I was doing everything like an early ceramics artist would be doing. I was doing low fire, medium, like mid fire and high fire work, terracotta, stoneware, porcelain, anything that I could get my hands on. And I came to a realization really quickly on that my work was lacking a specific direction and that I am a storyteller through and through. And I feel like a lot of people can tell really great stories with pots, but unfortunately, I wasn't one of them. So I needed something else, another way to, make my artwork. So two really big influential things happened around that time. I took a sculpting class with Linda Cordell and a metal smithing class with Cappy Cunard. Linda, she essentially taught me everything that I need to know about sculpting, and she really opened up my eyes to the ideas of outside of utilitarian ceramics. And I took this class with Cappy, and she was my metalsmithing teacher, and she really opened up my eyes that you can make objects that are both metals and clay and mixed media sculptures. So at this point in my career, the ideas, they were a little bit more introspective in the sense where I was making work that I had to challenge myself to make my own body of work. I was no longer getting these bodies of work that I was getting prompts from my professors. And I really needed to figure out what I wanted to make work about. And what I did was I started making work more narrative, figurative specifically. So more specifically, the ideas surrounded around ideas such as nostalgia and childhood memories. And for the first time, I was using my love for metalsmithing, and I created these mixed media sculptures like you see here. So mainly through things like hand fabricated rivets and little hinges, I would create these tension settings that would go around my ceramic objects to highlight the different areas that I wanted the viewer to focus on. Eventually, my sculptures quickly transformed into this literal depiction of stories that I was being told or experienced rather than more imaginative pieces. My grandmother moved into my parents' house when I was a really young age due to the fact that she had Alzheimer's. And that was a really big influential part in my life because we went to this average grandson-grandmother relationship to a lot deeper connection where I got to know her on a deeper level that I don't think I would have hadn't she had Alzheimer's. After my BFA, I went to the LUX Center for the Arts, and the added bonus for this was that I was actually able to pursue my metalsmithing career as well as my ceramics career because they had a metalsmithing studio. I quickly realized, however, that teaching alone at an artist residency wasn't necessarily paying the bills. So I thought back to something that my old professor told me. His name was Lee Rexroad, and he said, if I can immerse myself in my artwork, you can really make some really great pieces. So I answered a call for an activities director at an Alzheimer's and dementia nursing home, and I started working with the people that I was inspired with. So at this job, we would cook, we would play games, and maybe most memorably, I would bring in clay for them to make little personalized dinnerware that they would that I would later fire at the residency that I was at, and then they would eat their meals off of it the following weeks. They told me stories of love and loss and memories and friendship and family, and they were really opened up. They also talked to me about the struggles of aging in a world that felt so new every single day. Many of them, they had friends and family that lived nearby, but others weren't so lucky, having their closest relatives living across the country with limited interactions. Quickly, I realized that at times I was one of the last people to hear these stories, and I wanted to find a way that I could keep them alive. I began creating these sculptures for each of the stories that I was told that I found most memorable. At the end of my residency, I dedicated a solo show to the new friends that I met at my part-time job, and I was actually able to take all of those new friends there on a field trip with the help of some nurses that I met. After all of this work, I decided that it was time to get my master's degree, and I went to Indiana University, studied under Chris Boger, Tim Mather, Malcolm Mobutu Smith, and Chase Gamblin. And when I first got there, I was making similar work that I was making before, but the only problem was that I no longer had these people to influence me. They were no longer around me. So what do? You move on to a new body of work. And for me, that meant to look introspectively at myself. I started exploring themes of anxiety and body language. I altered the figure with objects that were both representational and abstract. Perhaps one of the most apparent comparisons to my older work that you see right here is the lack of the anatomical head. When I went into graduate school, I felt most comfortable sculpting the anatomical human head, and having that challenge of what does a figure look like without that. Really, I had a good time my professors really pushed me to do that. So taking away a figure's limbs, you really limit its mobility visually, and you might focus more on the body language of the piece. And taking away its head, you take away its identity and maybe make it a little bit harder to recognize. I did more metalsmithing work, and I focused my research on human behavior, thinking about things like stress and rumination. I looked at clinical studies, and I came across a theory called epigenetic transgenerational inheritance, which essentially discusses how traumas can be passed down from one generation to the next. My next body of work explored the ideas of perception versus reality, highlighting emotions and afflictions and identities that we hide behind versus what we disclose. I used the zipper in this work symbolically as a familiar object that we hold so close to our bodies. And it literally has the ability to open and close by design. So each single one of these pieces, there was a part or a segment where the zipper was open or forced open or broken open. So I had this hope that my viewers would come by and they would be encouraged to look inside and question the roles that this idea of an emotional facade plays in their own life. As far as how it plays in my own life, I really consider these emotional facades in my own life. I feel that I use my emotional facades the most when I'm feeling anxious or stressed out, or maybe in a social setting, as I'm sure a lot of you do as well. I really pondered how this imaginary barrier would look if I attributed line to emotion. So again, combining my love for metalsmithing and clay, I constructed these large steel cages to wrap around 4 different emotions that I found myself concealing the most. So as the cages around each head got denser and denser, the ability to see the portrayed emotion became more and more vague. At this time, as we mentioned earlier, I went to Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts and did a 1-year residency there. And I continued that zipped relation work, that body of work. And one thing that I want to say about this is I remember specifically a quote from when I was in graduate school. My late professor, Chris Boger, told me that a great sculptor can create an entire list of emotions with the slightest tension of one brow or one finger or even one toe. So I always try to keep that in the back of my mind whenever I'm trying to capture a specific emotion. This piece is titled Zipped Relation Covered, and it depicts that overwhelming feeling of being completely covered up by a facade, that emotional facade I was mentioning earlier, not being able to move and feeling completely encapsulated. Just for size, this is about 3 feet. Zip Relations Breakthrough is the title of this one. It's the triumph of breaking through a layer, feeling really good about something that you were holding back. And this last one I'm going to show you is called Zipped Relation Layers. And this is that realization of overcoming one facade, but that acknowledgement that there's maybe more to the layers underneath, and there's more things to work on as you continue your mental strife. So most people, at this time I was living in North Carolina, and like most people in 2020, I spent a lot of time indoors, and I began using the idea of home as inspiration. So my environment has always influenced my artwork in a certain way. And while on the lockdown, I felt like I became more and more aware of the walls that surrounded me. And I want it to be clear that I wouldn't say that this series was about COVID by any sense, but my response to the pandemic really put me in that mindset to come up with a lot of these ideas. So the homes, like the zippers, became a new form of that emotional suppression technique. I began thinking about all the places that I lived during my my life growing up, the really formidable times. And one place in particular was my house that I grew up in as a kid, and which is pictured below. In my youth, I was surrounded by an array of historical residencies with a couple new developments on the outskirts of Harrisburg. And it's funny to say now, but I was somewhat ashamed of my family's century-old home whenever I was young, because my classmates would come over and they were living in these giant McMansions. In stark contrast, my house had all these tiny little rooms that felt like a quirky maze with dingy, dark basements that not even my bravest friend would go down inside at night. In my adulthood, as I consider looking for homes for myself one day, or even homes to rent, or things that I am attracted to, it's these old creature comforts that I find most appealing. The characteristics that once brought me embarrassment have now become something that I actively seek out. With much of this body of work, I was inspired by liminal spaces within the architecture. These transitional areas, such as staircases, are often the focal feature of homes, yet a place where people just seem to pass by. So conceptually, with those ideas, I see that connection in the in-betweenness of these areas and the emotional facade state that I mentioned earlier. At this point, living in North Carolina, as I mentioned before, I began to really reach out to historical societies in my community and try to find homes that were historically significant. So this led me to being able to actually physically tour some of these homes and to get some more inspiration of the details inside of them. This is about roughly 3 feet as well. This piece in particular explores the historical brick duplexes that were very common near the railroad where I grew up. Every so often, these historical homes would need to be painted on their exterior. However, the neighbors in my town could never agree upon a color, and without fail, there was always one pillar or one dormer on these houses that were measured precisely down the middle and painted with two colors that would often clash with one another. And I think, thinking back at this, like, what's the significance? I think there's a beauty in the community aspect of living in a single dwelling together, yet never forgetting that you have this individual aesthetic that you're trying to prove and show off. So for about 1.5 to 2 years now, I've been more focused on this new body of work titled Molted Mindset that I have, that one piece in the Fahrenheit show. So much like my older work, there's this exploration on the human form and human behavior and identity. Lobsters and crabs and other crustaceans are these soft, mushy creatures with a hard outer shell. And when they grow, they feel confined and uncomfortable and swim to the ocean floor, and they cast off their shell in a process called molting. So the stimulus for the lobster to grow is that it feels pain. So I'm really interested in that analogy that in times of stress in life, it's also times of growth. So I just want to say for a second that I'm really honored that my piece was chosen for this show. And thank you so much for everything that the museum does. I wanted to, let's see if this video will play. Okay, yeah, I start each piece on a steel armature, just so you all can get an idea. I sculpt it completely solid. And I've tried sculpting hollow in the past, but it just doesn't necessarily work with what I do. I like being able to take large chunks of clay and completely alter the expression without compromising the structure of the piece. Once the figure is sculpted, I then put it back together. It's kind of like a brain surgery. And then I add all the details, such as the crabs in that piece. One of my favorite parts about developing a new series of work is experimenting with the surface. So with this body of work, particularly with the crustaceans, I'm layering a wide variety of glazes and underglazes and washes. And sometimes I'm using low fire glazes and firing them up higher on purpose to disrupt the stability and give a little bit more movement to the glazes that they interact with. And lastly, in my artist statement, I asked the question to my audience, if mental strife can be intrinsic to mental growth, if so, what do these new shells resemble in human form, and how can we learn from the ones that we have casted away? And that's a complicated answer for me, but my complicated answer is yes. While I do believe mental strife is intrinsic to mental growth, sometimes the journey is long and it can feel like a pinch on the lip while you wait. Just like the lobster, there is beauty in the process, and each shell we shed will shape us into our future self. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate the time that you let me talk today.
Thank you so much, Luke. I really do enjoy the process making of those.
Thank you so much.
Of course. And then now we're going to move on to Susannah. Let me introduce our next presenting artist. Susannah is an American ceramic artist living in Oakland, California. Her sculptures reveal a gritty yet passionate view of humanity drawn from city life. She was born in New York City, where she received a scholarship to Pratt Art Institute to study ceramics with Brian Temple. She received her BA and MFA in ceramics at San Francisco State University and taught sculpture and ceramics at Laney College, Oakland. Israel's expressive work is widely exhibited, appearing in the collections of the Archie Bray Foundation, Auckland Memorial Museum, New Zealand, Mint Museum's American Ceramics Collection, and the Yinggi Ceramics Museum, parks and libraries, and many others around the world. Wonderful. Let me share my screen.
what I would really do if it were up to me right now is just sit here for a while and think about all of the things that Luke has said. Thank you, Luke. That was really moving and fascinating and inspiring. And when I looked at your work and my work, I thought, well, what do they want here? A study in contrast? Not that there's anything wrong with that. Certainly. And now I'm thinking about how a circle has two ends, because with all the evident variations in our process and approach and inspiration sources, the idea of service and the idea of storytelling puts us side by side on the same path in a really deeply meaningful way. So let me just say thank you so much for that. And I'll go on with this. I just wanted to say hello, everyone, and thank you all for showing up. I'm going to talk about the piece in Fahrenheit 2024 in terms of my working process, how I do it, and the ideas that inspire it, why I do it. I am a storyteller. I tell stories with words, and I tell stories with sculpture. So there's always a story in my mind when I work. This image is in the show, the Fahrenheit show. It's Douglas fir. It's one of 6 heads from the Tree Crowns series, part of a sequence or ongoing series of what I call landscape figures. Next image, please. This is the Vulcan Warehouse Complex in Oakland, California. It was a working foundry from 1930 to 1980. It's in the post-industrial corridor of the city sector that runs from High Street to 105th Avenue. This is where I live, make my work, and write. It's gritty, it scares some people. It's been home for a long time, and I love it. It satisfies my 3 basic requirements. It's a home, it's a workspace, and a community. Next image, please.
All right. Okay.
So this is the very old and very beautiful Umpqua River, which runs north and south all along the coast of Oregon. In April 2023, I had a chance to spend the month as artist in residence at the Oregon Coast School of Art in the tiny, population 50, town of Gardner. I wanted to make a site-specific sculpture responding to this very different environment, and the river was really powerful inspiration. And really, my intentions with contrasting this image with the previous one is to illustrate just how amazing it can be to completely change up your world, and what it does, I think, for inspiration is important. So I begin by exploring, collecting, and then experimenting with form and textures. These are some ideas from my first few days. I was walking around, looking, drawing in my sketchbook, sometimes just sitting, staring at the river and the clouds and listening. I researched the ancient indigenous history of the river region, and what came to me was to have the trees speak for the place and the people. So as I'm doing this exploring, I started collecting different types of branches, little branches and twigs from the 6 types of trees that just cover the mountains in big stands. And there's spruce, Norfolk pine, hemlock, fir, and Douglas fir trees. And the way that the stands appear on the mountains, it can look from a distance like a lot of different heads in conversation. So I use these twigs and branches to directly form the textures for each of the crowns, just by pressing them here into slabs of wet clay. And I really was happy with that, although I'd never done it before. It gives them a delicacy of detail that I certainly couldn't achieve any other way. So the building process, this is fir. 3 work in process shots. The crown of the tree is, of course, its top. So what I did, this is about an 18-inch piece on the wet stage. I built the bust with really thick coils, somewhat like an armature working solid. We all have our different ways. This is a stable way of building for me, and it lets me work quickly and complete the piece in the wet stage. So I built the bust. You can see The ears are added after the crown. Put the crown on top and refine the head. And then I applied white slip. I apply slip at the wet clay stage. It's the technique probably everyone knows is called alla prima, and it means first thing in Italian. I use this approach because I want the immediacy of coloring the work as soon as it's formed. I don't like waiting for work to dry, to bone dry and go through the bisque and come back a different color and consistency and then have to figure out what I'm going to do with it any more than the next person. But unlike some other people who resign themselves to ceramic practice, I refuse. This is not necessarily for everybody. You can't edit, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. But other than that, with this image, I also wanted to say that the Oregon Coast School of Art is co-founded and run by Emily Free Wilson and Matt Wilson, and their business is Free Ceramics. And if you've ever seen their work, you'll remember this beautifully decorated, mostly lines, a lot of action, very graceful work on white clay. So I chose to use the clay and the colors that were in use at Oregon Coast and which were used by Free Ceramics as another way of opening myself to new process. This is pine, so washes of blue, green, yellow, and black in that order are applied over the base white layer. And I guess I already said this, I forgot to put it in here, that I had chosen the clay and the colors in response to being in a new environment. So here with pine from left to right, you can see the blue over the white, the yellow, and then the black. And what ends up here, what we see here ends up being a pretty delicate amount of texture that's picked up by these sequential washes. I wait for each of the layers, the washes, to dry enough that the next application will not blend with them, and because that becomes muddy and you lose your effect. And then in the first slide to the left, you can see fir, distantly in the background there, completed, and spruce with the white slip completed. And this again, this is spruce in progress with the color. Behind it, pine and fir now completed. So you see the white, the green, the yellow. I don't have an image for the black wash here. And this is essentially the process for each one of these three heads. Ultimately, there are going to be 6 of them, and they are in a way acting as test tiles. What about that cited piece, right? I mean, I'm only there for a month. Well, the tree crowns were a way for me to work out some ideas for the river piece, but I had just barely begun making those heads when I started coiling the large piece. And I was working downstairs. So the residency, the art center, is in a 2-story gigantic old former middle school. And my workspace was on the 2nd floor, and I built the large piece on a table next to the kilns on the 1st floor. So in my research, I found out that Umpqua, the Umpqua River, had several meanings, including thundering river, but especially that people were expected to bring the river a gift. And I thought, what kind of gift can I bring to a river, you know? And the gift I was trying to bring, I think, was an open mind. First, being aware of the river environment and the forest, this new and very different, very ancient place, finding ways to respond to it. All the landscape figures, which are certainly an ongoing inquiry for me, really arise from the question, what if this landscape were a person? Now, I don't ever make the heads first, except in this image where I did. And I did that because in the second image of the river, where you see that stand of trees to the right, I was sitting there and just taking it in, and this is a majestic, enormous landscape already. So it wasn't that unnatural, I suppose, for me to go to that heroic, more than heroic, that geologic scale. And I thought, what if that were the top of a figure landscaped head that just happens to be submerged in the river. And that really was the force that dictated everything about this, the shape, the form, the way that I was going to do it. So this is still work in progress. This is my live-in studio. An image of it was 700 square feet because it was a former classroom. So that's a lot of space on the second floor. So all the heads have been built at this point. There's left to right is hemlock, Norfolk pine, spruce, Douglas fir, pine, and fir. The first three heads, they're not in order, are finished, and the second larger trio is ready for color. I always put up drawings when I work, as you can make out on the wall, though you can't really see the drawings. And at this point, we're about halfway through the month. So I alternated. I was running up and down the first floor to the second floor several times a day, of course, because I was on a strict drying schedule, building and drying, and both sections were going to fit in the same kiln at once, which was a very large size electric scut. So I just kept going. As soon as the base was leather hard, I put the top on and continued working on the whole piece. Now here, I applied all the color before I put the piece into the kiln. But this is not, strictly speaking, alla prima. Much of the color application was at the leather hard stage for practical reasons. I didn't want the whole thing to soften up with wet slip on wet clay and collapse. And it was separated for firing. You can see the dividing line there in that sort of wavy form, and was once fired to cone 3, which is also the case for the heads. So considering the environment, and this is the overlap here, Luke, will entertain you, I suspect. So the second trio of heads in the Tree Crown series has this wide stripe of orange. It's very pretty, which is exactly what I thought when I first saw a forest infested with pine beetles in Montana. So I'm standing there at the lookout, admiring the color and wondering what had caused it. And everybody's looking at me funny, like there's something wrong with my mind. And I got an education of what had happened, because it is the fires that naturally kill the pine beetle infestations. Now fire prevention doesn't permit that anymore, because people are living in the forested areas and they have land and houses, and there's a large population now that means that the pine beetles can never be they never have that natural stop to their growth pattern. And so partly because it's dramatic and beautiful, and partly because I wanted to make a comment about it, I decided that I was going to introduce this to the second trio of heads. So this is a process shot. On the left is Douglas fir with the color applied, probably that same day. And then you can see hemlock, spruce, pine, and fir behind it. The middle image here is Douglas fir, and the right is hemlock, and they're dry and ready for the kiln, or drying and ready for the kiln. So this is a pretty recognizable stage. This is the chalky stage of raw glaze application, which we all know. You wonder what's happened because the piece doesn't look like the color it was, and it doesn't look like the color it's going to be. So that shouldn't be familiar. Nonetheless, I want to give you a caveat about alla prima, especially if you want to try it, because it's wonderful. You cannot edit. This is immediate and final. This light chalky surface on these two might have tempted me to pick up the brush. You know, where are my beautiful black shadows? Where's the blue? But don't. Everything you put there is still there, and it's going to be revealed by the thermochemical changes in the firing. I promise. Okay, and just to prove it, next image. So from that pale green mint image that we just saw, this is Douglas fir after firing. Again, in cone 3 in oxidation. The colors I'm using are Amico underglazes, again, because that's what they had at Oregon Coast School of Art. And no complaint about them, just to be specific. And you can see that, you know, the details are picked out, the texture of the crowns, you know, is clear. It's going to work out, so no panic with alla prima. So this is Uncle River in its cited. This is from a video by Sean Susannah, a long-term resident at Oregon Coast School of Art, and it's a video still. I'm featured in this. There's a great deal of information as well about the residency, and it's a beautiful video. I highly recommend it. This is not my image of choice, although I think that it shows the piece just fine. Ideally, I would want to get a slightly different angle and go a little bit lower so that you could see that the top of the head looks like that stand of trees on the horizon there, right there in the upper middle, but you can't have everything. It's an honor to have the piece there, and I really enjoyed doing it. And there was a lot of excitement in meeting that timeline, but we did it, so there it is. So I want to talk about landscape figures and, why would I go up there and try to make something that was a river forest person and so on. And this really goes back a long way, although I'm going backwards in time here, with the idea of what if this landscape were a person. And it comes from an amount of time in which you develop a personal relationship with the landscape sometimes. So this piece, Low Tide, is part of a sequence of sculptures called the Tidal Estuary Series. A sequence, you probably know this, is a series of series, and it comes to us from poetry, but we can take it for sculpture. The San Leandro Channel runs between Alameda and Oakland, and it's called the Estuary, at least locally. The tidal channel connects freshwater streams of East Bay Hills with the ocean. So every 24 hours, the fresh water flows into the bay, and then the current reverses with the tide, and it flows back as salty water. This environment is called brackish, and the wildlife and plants in this ecosystem all adapt to the cyclic changes. To me, it's a metaphor for life, and it's inspired many different versions of this sculpture. On my website, I have a page called Personal Landscapes where you can see them all if you want to. This is Shoreline, which I actually have subtitled because I've used this to Marsh Boat 2017, shown here at Ice House in Petaluma. It's one of the Tidal Estuary series. The duck and the little ducklings are from a press mold. An old one that, abandoned one from a pottery, I guess, that I found at a thrift store. And I often use the ducks to indicate shelter, safety, a peaceful environment. And so this was made in the spring. My idea was that in this case, the tidal estuary / person was basically taking a regal boat tour of its environment, looking on approvingly at all the little ducklings swimming around. And because to me, there was a boat metaphor and a kind of a regal figure, I put this little round cloth pillow in clay behind the figure, and a serpentine line that I used for many years. I did in bas relief here, which is kind of unique. So I'm fond of this piece. This is in a private collection now. Shoreline 2022. I thought that I had made enough of these, but I guess I hadn't. And so I'm glad that I made this one. It has some striking differences. One of my favorite things about it, artistically speaking, is the abstraction of the line of the right arm, the way it's both reed and arm and not quite right for either. The ducklings may or may not make sense where they're positioned, but they're supposed to stand in for sort of chaotic, fluttery motion. And especially, maybe we should always all do this, especially with the opportunity to juxtapose three different views of the sculpture. It almost feels like a conversation among three different entities looking at this, and emphasizes a lot of the gesture and the line. So, as always, no matter how consistently we think we're approaching an idea, we manifest different interpretations. This one's pretty big too. It's almost 4 feet, although you get a lot of extra height with those head things. This is a work that has not been finished yet. It's called Cider Creek, and it's going to be wood-fired this November. at the Cider Creek Collective in Albion in Mendocino County, California. And it will be installed at the creek after that. So I had the opportunity to spend a week there in July and make this piece, again, proposing a site-specific piece, again, spending time with this landscape. It wasn't precisely on the coast, it was more in the forest. And the environment of the Cider Creek Collective, which is an art center with a residency program, regular community wood firing events, which are extremely energy consuming and, a big community event. And just being there and experiencing the deeply collaborative creative partnership of artists Jess Thompson and Nick Schwartz, who basically dedicated their energy to this collective, meant that I created a piece really different from anything else I think I've ever done. It is essentially a portrait of these two people as partners. I don't do portraits, and I couldn't have if I tried, but in some ways this does resemble Nick and Jess. And I'm really pleased that it turned out as well as it has so far, and have high hopes for the wood fire. This is probably the beginning of, 2006 was, and this was 2011. But this was the first time that I had the opportunity to pursue landscape figures in one setting, following the idea almost literally from one piece to the next, and often working on several of them at once. When all of the pieces were done, they were shown at the Smart Gallery in San Francisco, Steve Allen's wonderful gallery and workshop in 2013. And so I really had a chance, sort of like those three images of shoreline, to see the variations interacting, that interplay for myself. The name of this one is Geography. It has the serpentine line for water, which I had used for as long as back to 2004. But again, this was really a conscious choice to show motion and to use that particular form. This is me responding to the California landscape between Oakland and San Jose. I got to be artist in residence at Black Bean Studios, the brainchild of Ruben Reyes and Will Johnson, from 2011 to 2012. And the round trip back and forth between San Jose and Oakland inspired a major group of figure landscapes. Anybody who's driven the California highways knows that it already looks like there are a bunch of velvety yellow people sprawled on the hills taking naps and looking at you. So this was not much of a stretch, but it certainly was a joy to do. This is an image. The title of this work, this is one of three sections of a cited piece entitled "We Are the Body, the Boat, and the Water," which is from a poem. It's shown here in the Brickyard at Archie Bray Foundation in Montana. One of my objectives that I'm happy to have met was to have the terracotta of the figure be as close to matching the brick as I could. It has three sections that represent 2002, 2011, and 2024, because I've been fortunate enough to be artist in residence over 3 different decades in 3 different capacities at Archie Bray. A summary of the whole piece is that it's about many things: love and loss, creative community, and a very long and wonderful life in clay. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susannah. I'm going to move on to Q&A portion. So if anyone has a question, you can either write it into the chat and I can ask that artist, or you can use the raise hand emoji and you can actually ask the artist yourself. Oh, let me go here. No worries. I can also ask plenty of questions. But one of the questions I do have for Luke is, Luke, would you ever think of maybe not doing the figures since now you've got into crustaceans?
Yeah, that's something that I have actually kind of played around with. And actually, the last piece that I made was only crustaceans, and it was kind of on a big, almost like plinth that I made. And I kind of have been thinking about, how much of these other objects that I'm putting in, because they'll still represent the figure in some way or not. Um, but as of right now, I love combining the two. I think that it's kind of like a love of mine. But I could foresee myself doing more of an abstracted figurative piece with no actual human representation of it at all.
Mhm. It's interesting just because we really do love those crabs in Fahrenheit.
Thank you.
And it seems that Carly Slade has a question. So, Carly, you can ask away.
Hi.
Huh?
Hey, I'm looking on your Instagram. What are the black boxes that like the shrimp are sitting on, or the crabs or lobsters? Sorry if I mislabeled your crustaceans.
Oh, no worries. So those are just little test pieces that I was testing out different glaze. So they're about hand-sized sculptures about this big. Or are you looking at the one that we were just the big giant one?
To show you my technology of your technology. Well, it
Yes,
looks like
yes.
this is like
Okay, see, that was the one that I was just talking about with Pam. The one where I was just kind of exploring what the piece would look like if I didn't include the figurative elements at all, or the human representation of the figure. So, still talking about the figure a little bit, but just only using the lobsters on there.
but what's the black box, and then why is there like black like lattice work in them?
Yeah, so that was more of like a grate that I was kind of playing with, and I wanted to kind of think about the way that these ideas are sucking in and sucking out, and trying to use other texture for symbolism through some of the ideas that I was making. So that's kind of a new thing that I've been playing around with, but it seems to be kind of popping up here and there, different things that I've been kind of attracted to on my day-to-day commute, just noticing things. And the grate was something that has been, I guess, popping up lately.
Mhm. Plus, it combines
Thanks.
pretty well with the crustaceans, the lobsters, crabs.
Makes me think of those grates we have here that say on them like this water runs to the ocean.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Yeah, there's definitely some connections in there. I 100% agree with that.
Wonderful. And then I do have a question I have two questions. One from Dawn for Susannah. Do you have any residencies or exhibitions planned in the future?
Hey, Dawn, I'm glad you made it. I know you had some travels in there. I must say that for the summer, the only I'm still recovering from my intensive 14 to 18-hour days at Archie Bray. So at this point, I'm not planning to do a great deal. However, I'm really happy to say that Don Hall, as Don Hall Works videographer, clay videographer extraordinaire, is going to be kind enough to work with me. I hope this is going to be our summer project, but we haven't scheduled it yet, on a video of asphalt and honey. And that's a project I haven't touched on, of course, in this presentation, but I worked on it from 2022 to 2024. I was lucky to get some funding, but I never could find a venue for display for it, which can happen. And so I'm excited because the video is something that, you can post on Instagram and anyone and everyone can see it at their convenience. So that's exciting. The summer works. All right, we are on it. Thank you.
Great. And we have another question from Cindy for Susannah and Luke. What helps you move from a concept to a narrative story to sculpting?
Mm. Do you want me to go first, Susanna, or would you rather?
I'm sorry, mine may not be very contributory, but it's very short. I'll go first. There is no conscious gap there. If I think, what if this landscape were a person? I'm ready to reach for some clay and follow how it's looking at me over its shoulder, or what I think I'm going to want to represent that, fading sunlight with in color, or how it reminds me of walking on the beach and feeling like no one else was there when I was a kid. It just is one kind of flow of multiple streams of, elements of thought. I know that's not very helpful for other people, but I think we all do have our process. And I think that what I'm describing is really just a kind of, like a jet stream version of what everybody's process really is.
That was great. I think for me, it's very intuitive where I will experience something, whether it's talking with somebody, something that I go to a specific event, if I see something while I'm on my day-to-day commute, and then it's something that brings me joy, brings me sadness. Maybe it's a song that I'm hearing, whatever it is, a specific interaction or a memory that I had with another person. And I think that there's beauty in creating artwork that's specifically about yourself introspectively, because I think others may have similar experiences, while not exactly, but I think they're relatable, maybe like close cousins, I would say. So for me, it's anything that really kind of strikes me in the heart in the moment. And I do a little bit of journaling, and from then on, but my journaling, I would say, as far as like my sketchbook goes, it's very messy, very quick, like 30-second drawings, and I might fill up a whole book of these 30-second drawings really quickly, and it might not even be hard to, it might be kind of hard to understand what's happening in there, but in my mind I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and this, which is kind of weird because my sketches are so sloppy, but then I'll like spend these meticulous hours, making little crab claws and dots and everything like that. So there is that kind of juxtaposition between those two.
Great. And then it seems, any other questions from anyone else? And I just have one more question for both of you. It seems like from your process and concept, you guys seem to be absorbed by like instances, memories, pretty much your surroundings. But does anything political really stand out to you? Since you guys are just affected by I can tell, Susannah, you work more on landscape. So depending on where you're at, it seems like you do approach kind of those stories that aren't like native to where you're working. And Luke, do you ever feel like you're affected politically by the climate?
I feel that I feel like everyone is affected by
Yeah.
the political climate. But as far as my work goes, I think that it doesn't necessarily. Well, a lot of my work is based around things like sociology and psychology and the research that I do, epigenetics, different things along those lines. And I think there's like ties with the way that people react to the political climate, but it's not necessarily 100% derived from that instance.
Really. Did you want to add anything else, Susanna, before we wrap up?
I think that that's a terrific question. Um, it's typical, and I think more and more typical as we spend time in practice and in life, to have more than one inquiry ongoing. So for this presentation, I focused pretty closely on the piece in the exhibition
Mhm.
and things that relate to it in my clay practice. I really want to support the question and commend Luke, I think, for making plain something that is perhaps voiced by one of our very most historically political contemporary artists, whom we've just lost, when Faith Ringgold famously says, the personal is political. And I think, Luke, that I'm specifically hearing from you a deep level of service, of compassion, of social awareness, and a compelling direction of pushing for change in that. And I think there are very many ways to do that. In the main, my work is very political. I term myself a justice artist. And I don't think that we have to, I'm not saying that you're suggesting this at all. I don't think that we have to live under one or another umbrella and sometimes go back and forth. I think it's a really good question.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Susannah and Luke, for all of your guys' insights. And now I want to thank everyone who came today to this talk, and I hope you all have a chance to come out to see Fahrenheit 2024. And if not, we have plenty of digital media on our website at amoca.org. But the show will be up for some time now until September. So please come through, and you can learn more about our exhibitions on our website. And if you follow us on Instagram, and this recording for this talk will be available on our website in the coming weeks. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.